This video will introduce how to create question pools and tests within Blackboard that you may wish to use in your module for formative assessments. To set up your first question pool, you'll need to access the Control Panel part of your module. Click on Course Tools to expand the menu, and then from the available selections, choose Tests, Surveys and Pools. You'll have three choices. The first of these, Tests, allows you to set up a one-time quiz or test that you'll only use once in the module. Surveys allow you to do a similar thing, but student responses are not scored and the data that you collect is presented to you in an anonymous aggregated format. That is to say, it will show you how many students overall answered a particular way rather than an individual response. Finally, we're interested in pools, that is, to create a bank of questions which you can then reuse as often or however you like. Once you've chosen to build a pool, you have some choices. If you've already been given a pool of questions by a colleague, usually as a zip file that they've exported from Blackboard already, you could choose to import pool and import those into your own module. If you want to add to an existing pool from those that are available, you would do this by choosing the Option button next to the item as you would conventionally in Blackboard. If, however, you're wanting to build a new pool of questions, then choose Build Pool. Just as with creating any other item in Blackboard, you have to define a name. This would depend very much on how you are going to use your quizzes or tests. Are you doing a weekly quiz? Perhaps you're going to create pools of questions based on topics that are contained within your module, so you can mix and match later for revision tests or mock tests, or, as we'll touch on later in this video, providing randomized tests for each student. After giving it a name, you may find it useful to include a description and instructions as to how you intend to use this pool in the future. Once you've given your pool a name and defined its instructions, after you've pressed Submit, you should receive a confirmation banner at the top of the screen in green. You're now ready to start creating your individual questions. But before we look at the question types that you could use, just be sure to confirm your question settings, the orange button located to the right. Question settings define how your questions will behave in terms of the feedback given to the students and what you can include in the questions, such as documents, pictures, embedded videos and so on. It's good practice to check these for every test pool and every test you set up, so that your creation options and the student experience are as fully featured and as rich as possible. So what are the question settings? Well, section 1 covers feedback. Is your test going to be used as a piece of formative assessment, in which case feedback on each question is essential? Section 2 looks at images, files and external links. Think about what sort of content you will likely include in your questions. Will any of them involve reading a document? What about viewing an image or a video? Will any of the feedback and the answers include the same sort of material? Section 3 looks at metadata. This could be useful if you're creating many pools of questions and are planning extensive use of tests throughout your module, allowing you to index and search questions not just based on the actual question or which pool they are in, but also according to the type of question they are. Section 4, scoring, is relatively self-explanatory. Will they be scored? What's the default point value for each answer that they give? Finally, Section 5 covers how the test will be displayed. Which questions are going to be on screen? Will it be all at once? Will it be presented in a random fashion? When you've defined and ticked the relevant boxes, press Submit to move on. You are now back at the pool canvas, where you create your questions or bring them in from other sources or other pools that you may already have. We're going to look in this example at what types of questions are available to you. So choosing the Create Question option, you'll see a list of many question types. Most of the types are self-explanatory, but let me just pick out a few that aren't and the implications of using them. Essay and file response type questions require manual marking. That means no marks or feedback is available to the students until you have intervened and manually marked those responses. Quiz Bowl is essentially a question in reverse. You provide the answer and the student response must be in the form of a question. For example, the answer you give is Martin Hall. The correct response from the student would be, what is the name of Salford University's Vice-Chancellor? Hotspot is an image-based question where you task the student to select a point on an image. For example, identify the femur in this X-ray of a patient's leg. It should be noted though that with this type of question you can only have one particular spot or range as the correct answer, so you can't ask compound questions such as identify the femur and where it connects to the hip, for example. With each question you create, you'd provide a generic title, the specific question wording, the answers, both correct and incorrect, and, for some, such as fill in the blank, acceptable variations in the answer to account for minor spelling differences. You would also provide a range of feedback for both correct and incorrect student responses. Remember, we're using Blackboard Tests primarily as a form of formative assessment. Any feedback given should help the student identify how to improve rather than simply a right or wrong answer. Once you've set up and completed building your question pools, you then build an individual test with which to include them. From the Test, Survey and Pools menu in the control panel, you would click on Tests, then Build Test, and from that Build Test canvas you would choose Reuse Question. That would allow you to then find questions you'd already created and bring them in from whichever pool they are stored. Do remember, even when you create a test, you will need to review the individual test question settings. Choosing to reuse questions, you'll have options as to how you're going to do this. Find questions is the simplest form of using your question pools. You can browse through any pool, any test, and pick specific questions that you want to use in the test you're putting together. A more interesting approach is to use the random block feature. One of the criticisms of using a standard test is that every student will be presented, even with a randomized order, the same set of questions. However, what random block allows you to do is specify specific pools or tests and simply say how many questions you want from them, or how many of a given question type, or covering a specific topic if you've included metadata when creating your questions. That means, with enough pools of questions, each student could experience a test that is different from their other classmates.